The year is 48 CE. A girl barely 15 steps through the marble gates of the Palatine Palace. The air trembles with music, the Senate bows, and the people chant her name. Draped in white silk, her eyes lower beneath a wreath of myrtle. She looks like purity carved from marble, yet history would remember her for something far darker. Before her stands Emperor Claudius, a man in his 50s whose limp betrays his fragility and whose stammer hides an empire's desperation. Rome is still bleeding from Caligula's madness, and the people crave virtue, stability, something sacred to cleanse the stain of the past. They thought this girl would be salvation. They were wrong. Her name was Valeria Messalina, and within a decade she would turn the palace of emperors into a temple of corruption, a labyrinth of pleasure, fear, and humiliation. Behind closed doors, senators wept, noble families broke, and Rome's mask of civilization slipped. Her enemies tried to erase her name from every stone, to bury her deeds beneath centuries of silence. But power leaves traces, and desire writes in blood. So tonight, we reopen the forbidden chapter Rome tried to destroy, the horrifying intimate practices of its most perverted empress. When the marble doors of the Palatine opened for Valeria Messalina, Rome thought it had found its redemption. She was only 15, a child dressed as a goddess, her face radiant beneath the glow of torches as senators bowed their heads in reverence. Behind her, the shadow of the empire loomed, an empire still trembling from the blood-soaked chaos of Caligula's rule. The corridors still smelled faintly of iron, the stains of assassination barely scrubbed from the mosaic floors. Rome was exhausted, terrified, desperate for something pure to believe in. And so, when the trembling hand of Emperor Claudius reached for hers, the entire city exhaled. He was 50, a man haunted by the ghosts of his lineage, mocked for his limp, dismissed for his stammer, but now crowned with absolute power. He needed legitimacy, a symbol of rebirth, and Messalina, with her divine lineage and angelic beauty, was offered as proof that Rome could still pretend to be virtuous. Her bloodline traced back to Augustus himself, her features sculpted by privilege, her manner molded by tutors who whispered the virtues of modesty and obedience. To the Senate, she was the embodiment of chastity, a living marble statue of Roman womanhood. But in the grand design of the empire, purity was never more than a performance. Beneath the silks and smiles, Messalina was not being prepared for life, she was being weaponized for it. She was told her worth was measured by her womb, her silence, her ability to produce heirs who could pacify the political storm that threatened to tear Rome apart. Each lesson in grace, each command to lower her eyes, each vow to remain untouched before marriage was less a virtue and more a chain wrapped around her spirit. When Claudius took her as his wife, it wasn't a love story, it was an act of survival. The Praetorian Guard had just murdered an emperor, the Senate was fractured, and the mob hungered for stability. Claudius was never meant to rule, he was the man they found trembling behind a curtain after Caligula's body hit the ground. His reign began not with applause, but with disbelief. To hold the throne, he needed a dynasty, an heir, a divine image to convince the people that the gods still favored Rome. Messalina, beautiful and young, became that image, a symbol of renewal painted over decay. But symbols have a way of turning against those who create them. Inside the palace, she quickly learned that virtue meant submission and silence. Her every movement was choreographed, her words measured, her gaze trained to convey humility before the public. Yet behind the walls of marble and incense, she began to see how the empire truly worked. The senators who praised morality by day visited brothels by night. The generals who lectured on honor bribed their way to command. The emperor himself relied on freedmen and slaves to manipulate decrees while pretending to uphold justice. The hypocrisy was endless, and for a young mind already sharpened by observation, it was intoxicating. The palace wasn't a temple of order, it was a theater of deceit, and Messalina, born into its audience, was now being forced onto the stage. With every passing month, the distance between the girl she was and the empress she was expected to be widened. The crown that glimmered like salvation became a collar of gold. Claudius, gentle but distant, treated her like a relic to be guarded rather than a partner to be understood. He spent his days with scrolls and state affairs, leaving her nights filled with silence and curiosity. In that void, something began to shift. A hunger took root, not for affection, but for control. The very power she was told to never touch began whispering her name. and though she smiled beside her husband during ceremonies, the seeds of rebellion were already buried deep within her heart. Rome would remember her as a monster. But monsters are not born. They are carved by the world that fears them. Messalina was carved from the marble of hypocrisy, shaped by an empire that demanded perfection while drowning in sin. And in the years to come, that contradiction would erupt in ways so horrifying, so intimate, that even the chroniclers of Rome trembled to record them. The first years of her reign unfolded with the calculated serenity of a fresco painted to deceive. Messalina walked the marble halls like a vision of piety, her head bowed beneath veils of white linen, her arms always folded in meek composure beside her husband's throne. She gave the empire what it wanted most: continuity. A daughter, Claudia Octavia, born into the sound of temple bells. Then a son, Britannicus, his name itself a celebration of conquest and order restored. The Senate praised her devotion, poets sculpted her image in verse, and the people whispered that Rome, after so much chaos, finally had its empress of virtue. Every movement of hers was rehearsed, every public smile a performance designed to convince a weary empire that the gods had forgiven its sins. Yet behind those veils of holiness, something darker was beginning to stir. The role she played was too small for the fire that lived beneath her skin, too scripted for a mind that had learned how to watch and calculate. Claudius was absorbed in paperwork and decrees, while Messalina sat in chambers where silence dripped like wax and power drifted through the air like forbidden perfume. She could feel it, invisible but tangible, moving between senators' conversations, between the emperor's hesitations, between the servants' fearful glances. It called to her. Rome divided its women the way it divided its gods, sacred and profane, Madonna and courtesan, the keeper of virtue and the destroyer of men. But Messalina had begun to understand the secret both sides shared, that all power, whether political or carnal, began with submission and ended in control. In public, she played the mother of the empire. In private, she began testing the edges of her cage. A whisper to a senator about his loyalty. A soft suggestion about which family should be invited to dine. A favor granted to one nobleman, withheld from another. She discovered that men who imagined themselves powerful could be undone not by armies, but by the curve of a smile or the promise of a secret. Every act of obedience became a performance of manipulation. Every look of chastity concealed a negotiation. The empire that had crowned her to restore its virtue was slowly binding itself to her will. The chronicles would later claim she descended into depravity without cause, but the truth was more intricate. Her corruption was not born of lust, it was born of revelation. She began to see that the same men who lectured on purity kept slaves for pleasure, that the same priests who preached fidelity hid concubines in temple chambers, that senators who demanded her modesty could not meet her gaze without trembling. What they feared most in her was not sin, it was reflection. She showed them what they already were, stripped of their illusions. Power in Rome had always worn a masculine face, but Messalina began to sculpt her own image of it, one both tender and terrifying, a power born from intimacy. At first it was rumor, a stray glance at a banquet, a whispered name passed through the corridors of marble. Then came the stories of late-night visits, of secret gatherings where the empress demanded not worship but surrender. Her palace chambers became both sanctuary and snare. There, she would test boundaries no matron dared cross. A senator summoned under pretense of counsel might find himself cornered not by decree but by desire, and in that moment of weakness she would read his soul. Some resisted, but fewer twice. For every man who defied her, another begged to be seen, touched, forgiven. She had found the empire's true weakness. It was not rebellion or war, but shame. Rome's power was built on appearances, and Messalina learned that by corrupting appearances she could rule unseen. The irony was exquisite. The empire that had tried to sculpt her into a saint had created its own destroyer. Within her youth burned an intelligence that saw hypocrisy as opportunity. Every scandal she initiated, every transgression she whispered into existence, was a mirror held up to the Senate's face. To control Rome, she would not need legions, she needed secrets, and soon the very walls of the palace began to breathe them. Servants disappeared after witnessing too much. Aristocrats who had shared her bed swore eternal loyalty, not out of love but out of terror that their indulgence might be exposed. Even Claudius, buried in his ledgers and speeches, began to sense something poisonous blooming within his own house. Yet he did what men in power often do when faced with a truth too heavy to bear. He looked away. Messalina's world was now divided between daylight and darkness. In daylight, she played the mother of Rome. In darkness, she learned to make even virtue tremble. Each whisper she uttered spread like incense through the empire, invisible but inescapable. And as her desires deepened, so did her hunger. Not for pleasure alone, but for domination through pleasure, a kind of rule that no emperor could ever claim, because it began not in conquest, but in surrender. Rome did not yet realize it, but the throne of Claudius had already begun to tilt, not through war or betrayal, but through the quiet, horrifying intimacy of one woman's awakening. By the time Messalina's desires ripened into power, the palace itself had become her private theater. The feasts that once symbolized Rome's discipline turned into arenas of indulgence where masks fell and the true faces of its rulers were exposed. Senators reclined on ivory couches, golden platters glistened with honey-soaked delicacies, and censers filled the hall with the scent of myrrh that concealed the stench of fear. Claudius presided in weary detachment, content to let the illusion of harmony soothe his insecurities, while Messalina orchestrated spectacles that blurred the line between ceremony and corruption. Every gesture she made carried dual meaning. What appeared as entertainment to the naive was, to the initiated, an initiation of control. Her banquets began with toasts to virtue and ended with silence broken by gasps, laughter, and the quiet collapse of reputations. The empress had learned that shame could enslave men more efficiently than chains, and she wove it into a ritual so elaborate that no victim could escape without becoming complicit. At first, these gatherings seemed harmless, an evening of music, a recitation from poets, a game of wit among Rome's elite. But when the servants withdrew and the doors closed, the air thickened with a tension that neither words nor prayer could dissolve. Gladiators still dusted with the sands of the arena appeared beside actors and captives from distant provinces. The aristocrats who once prided themselves on refinement found themselves stripped of dignity, commanded to amuse their sovereign in contests that mocked their honor. No blade was drawn, no decree pronounced, humiliation itself became the instrument of punishment. Those who faltered in performance awoke days later to find their estates confiscated, their families under scrutiny, their allies suddenly deaf to their pleas. Messalina turned the moral code of Rome upside down and forced its guardians to dance upon its ruins. Inside those walls, she redefined pleasure not as indulgence, but as hierarchy. Each touch, each command, each calculated act of mercy reminded her subjects that the difference between disgrace and survival depended on her whim. The women of noble birth who entered her circle expecting refinement discovered instead that the empress demanded confession through degradation. Some chroniclers claim she forced them to compete for her amusement, pairing them with men of lower station, erasing centuries of class distinction with a gesture. Whether those accounts were exaggerated or not, they reveal how the myth of chastity became her greatest weapon. She understood that in a society where purity was power, corruption was liberation. By breaking the rules, she made the rules meaningless, and that was the most terrifying revolution of all. Outside the palace, Rome whispered. Merchants repeated tales of orgies more theatrical than the plays at the Colosseum. Philosophers condemned her as an omen of decadence. Yet none dared confront her, because every critic was already entangled in the net she had spun. The senators who cursed her name by day sought her favor by night. The generals who swore to defend honor had already surrendered theirs in her chambers. Even the scribes who recorded decrees learned to leave certain pages blank, fearing that one misplaced phrase might mark them for ruin. Messalina had created a kingdom of silence where every tongue was tied by guilt, and every smile concealed a bruise on the soul. It is difficult, across centuries, to know where history ends and rumor begins. But what endures in every account is the same haunting truth, that her empire of desire was not sustained by lust alone, but by knowledge. Knowledge of what people hide, of what they crave, of what they fear being seen. She wielded intimacy as a blade sharper than any sword, carving obedience from pleasure and loyalty from terror. Each night that ended in laughter left behind another scar on Rome's conscience. And though the marble baths were rinsed clean by dawn, the echoes of those games lingered in the eyes of men who pretended they had never taken part. Messalina's Rome had become a mirror. Every noble who looked into it saw his own corruption staring back. What had begun as the empire's refuge of virtue was now its most secret brothel, a place where civilization confessed its sins to the woman it had tried to sanctify. And as she stood amid that tangle of power and degradation, Messalina must have believed herself untouchable. But empires, like lovers, tire of submission. The stage she built for others' humiliation would soon become the setting of her own undoing. ChatGPT said, "Autumn descended upon Rome with the same quiet unease that precedes a storm. The city, weary of excess yet addicted to it, still bent beneath Messalina's shadow. By now, she was not merely an empress, she was a force, a whisper that could unmake careers, a glance that could alter laws. Her reign of pleasure had matured into a reign of terror disguised as seduction. Claudius, ever the scholar lost among his scrolls and decrees, convinced himself that ignorance was peace. He chose not to see what every servant, senator, and soldier already knew, that the woman he called wife ruled through the most ancient of weapons, humiliation. And yet, even by the standards of Rome's corruption, what came next was beyond comprehension. For in the year 48 CE, Messalina decided that her dominion over desire was not enough. She wanted legitimacy, the kind of power that did not need to hide behind curtains or feast tables. And to claim it, she would perform the most scandalous act in imperial memory: marry another man in broad daylight while still Empress of Rome. The man she chose was Gaius Silius, consul designate, young, ambitious, and dangerous in all the ways Claudius was not. He was Rome's golden image of masculinity, sculpted in muscle and rhetoric, the sort of man poets compared to Mars and politicians envied in silence. Their liaison began, perhaps, as another indulgence, a forbidden thrill in a palace built upon them. But soon the boundaries between pleasure and rebellion dissolved. Silius, intoxicated by proximity to the empress and the power she wielded, became her mirror and accomplice. Together they envisioned an empire reshaped in their image, youthful, unashamed, unfettered by the frailties of the old emperor who ruled in name alone. Whether it was genuine love, madness, or calculation that drove her, none can say. But the audacity of her next move stunned even those accustomed to scandal. She did not hide it, did not whisper it in candlelit corridors. Instead, she summoned witnesses, musicians, priests. In the heart of Rome, Messalina, the lawful wife of Claudius Caesar, stood adorned in bridal white and bound herself to another man, as though the gods themselves had sanctioned her betrayal. The sources recount the moment with disbelief, as if the world itself paused. The Senate froze. The Praetorian guards exchanged glances, uncertain whether to laugh or draw their swords. The citizens, always hungry for spectacle, gathered in murmuring awe. Was this blasphemy, or was it revolution? Some whispered that she intended to overthrow Claudius altogether, to crown Silius as emperor beside her. Others believed she had simply gone mad from impunity, so accustomed to bending reality to her will that she no longer recognized its limits. Whatever her intent, the act tore through Rome's moral fabric like fire through silk. The empire had tolerated her excesses because they were hidden in shadow. But now, in the full gaze of day, she dared to challenge not just custom, but the divine sanctity of imperial authority itself. When word reached Claudius, he was in Ostia, tending to the city's grain supply, an image of diligence that now seemed pitiful in its irony. Surrounded by clerks and ledgers, he was the last man in Rome to learn that his wife had remarried. His freedman Narcissus, loyal and cunning, broke the news in trembling haste. Imagine the scene: the emperor, bent over documents, his hand still clutching the stylus as disbelief drains the color from his face. How do you tell the ruler of the world that his empress has replaced him before witnesses? How do you make him understand that his household has become the stage of history's cruelest satire? At first, Claudius refused to believe it. But then came confirmations, letters, testimonies, reports from the Senate itself. The marriage contract was signed, sealed, and blessed by priests. What began as rumor solidified into reality, and the emperor's shame turned to rage. He returned to Rome, not as a scholar, but as a wounded beast, the Praetorian guard at his back and fury in his eyes. The same corridors where Messalina once commanded laughter now echoed with the march of soldiers. They found her in the gardens of Lucullus, the estate that had been her refuge and her stage. Surrounded by luxury, fountains murmuring beside imported cypress trees, she appeared as if frozen in disbelief. Her mother, Lepida, pleaded for her to act, to beg, to run, anything but silence. But Messalina, who had made Rome tremble with her audacity, now stood paralyzed before the consequences of her own myth. Perhaps she still believed she could seduce fate itself. Perhaps she could not comprehend that the same empire she had toyed with was now reclaiming its dignity through vengeance. The soldiers did not speak. Their orders were simple and final. When the blade came, it was not swift heroism, but quiet inevitability. Some accounts say she tried to take her own life but lacked the strength. Others claim she waited for the stroke without resistance. Either way, the end was as intimate as her crimes. A whisper, a shudder, a fall upon the grass that had once cushioned the footsteps of her revels. Claudius did not attend the execution. He simply signed the decree that erased her name from every inscription, every statue, every public memory. Damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. The empire that had adored her beauty now celebrated her erasure. Yet even as her statues were dragged through the streets and shattered, her story had already escaped the reach of stone and decree. Rome could destroy her image, but not the fascination she had ignited. For in the secret hearts of those who had feared her, there lingered a truth that no hammer could break, that she had shown them who they really were. In the days that followed her death, Rome moved swiftly to cleanse itself of the woman it had created. The marble likenesses of Messalina that once adorned the forums were pulled from their pedestals and shattered in the streets. Her name was struck from inscriptions, her portraits melted into anonymity, her memory condemned by decree. The Senate applauded, as if purging a disease. The temples offered sacrifices of purification. Claudius, hollowed by humiliation and rage, signed the orders with a trembling hand, yet behind that ink lay something more fragile than vengeance fear. Fear that history would remember what he could not bear to face. He had ruled an empire, but could not command his own house. He had restored stability to Rome, but lost mastery over his own name. So he consigned his wife to oblivion, believing that by erasing her, he might erase the reflection of his weakness that her story had revealed. Yet erasure is a fragile art. What men attempt to bury in silence often grows louder in memory. Messalina's fall did not simply end a scandal, it exposed the foundation upon which the empire itself rested. Rome's grandeur had always been an illusion of virtue, its marble glow concealing rot beneath. For years her debauchery had been whispered as proof of personal madness, but the truth was more corrosive. Her sins were Rome's sins, magnified and made visible. Every senator she humiliated had already betrayed his vows in secret. Every noblewoman who envied her power had bartered her own for survival. Every priest who condemned her excess had absolved worse crimes for gold. When Messalina died, the empire rejoiced not because it had conquered evil, but because it could once again pretend to be innocent. Yet the lesson she left behind was indelible, that civilization's moral code was merely a stage set, and beneath it pulsed the same appetites that had driven her. The more they condemned her, the more they revealed themselves. Centuries later, historians would argue whether she was truly the monster described by Roman chroniclers, or a victim of the propaganda machine that sought to bury any woman who dared to wield power outside the bounds of obedience. The records we have, written by men, shaped by politics, blur the line between truth and punishment. Perhaps she was a manipulator of immense cunning, perhaps a product of cruelty and neglect, or perhaps both at once. What cannot be denied is the magnitude of her shadow. For even as the hammer struck her statues, whispers continued in the streets, carried by servants who had seen her smile in the torchlight, by soldiers who had stood in her halls, by lovers who could not forget the gaze that made emperors falter. Her ghost remained not in marble but in memory, a quiet defiance against the empire that had sought to unmake her. Claudius remarried within months, seeking stability in the arms of another, the ambitious Agrippina the Younger, a woman more patient, more calculating, and far more dangerous. Through her son Nero, she would later poison Claudius himself and carry Rome into another age of madness, proving that the cycle of corruption never ends, it merely changes form. Messalina's children would not escape the curse of her bloodline. Octavia, forced to wed Nero, would die on his orders at 22, accused of adultery by a man who knew no fidelity. Britannicus, the son once hailed as the hope of Rome, was poisoned during a banquet, his final breath swallowed by the laughter of those pretending not to notice. In erasing Messalina, Rome had only delayed its reckoning. The empire's rot continued to bloom beneath new names, new faces, new gods. And yet, 2,000 years later, her story still breathes. Stand among the ruins of the Palatine Hill where the marble has crumbled into dust, and the air still carries the weight of her defiance. Not as a ghost, not as legend, but as a reminder of what power does to those who are denied it and what those who wield it become. The gardens where she once ruled in silk and sin now lie silent, their fountains long dry, yet in the imagination of history she lives endlessly. An empress both damned and eternal. Rome tried to silence her with decrees, but memory is the empire no ruler can conquer. For every historian who cursed her name, another found fascination. For every sculptor who shattered her likeness, another secretly carved it again. The truth of Messalina cannot be destroyed because she was never merely a woman. She was the embodiment of the contradiction Rome refused to face, that purity and corruption are born of the same longing, that desire and destruction often wear the same crown. So the stones of her palace may be broken, her name may be carved out of marble, and her life may be written in scandal and ash, but her echo endures. It lingers in every empire that mistakes repression for virtue, in every society that condemns the very appetites it secretly adores. Messalina's story survives not because Rome wanted her remembered, but because human nature cannot forget its own reflection. She was the mirror of an age that worshipped discipline and drowned in decadence. And in that mirror, across centuries, we still see ourselves.